salesianas, que apenas empezaban en esa época, y colaboramos luego en la dirección de un par de estudiantes de unas tesis de maestría, y hemos seguido colaborando y sobre todo teniendo discusiones muy interesantes a lo largo de los años. Y pues ha sido, como decía, un role model, como dicen, para mí realmente José Luis. Y bueno, pensé en este tema que les voy a platicar hoy, aunque no es algo que haya colaborado directamente con él, porque creo que es un tema muy interesante, espero que sea de interés de José Luis y de todos ustedes, y para mí es tal vez de los temas que estoy trabajando actualmente el que se me hace más interesante a futuro. Y bueno, es un tema que interesa desde hace mucho tiempo, ¿no? Toda esta frase de Demócrito que dice, preferiría descubrir una causa o una ley causal que tener el reino de Persia. Entonces, como que el poder descubrir, encontrar causalidad o leyes causales es algo que a mucha gente y en la ciencia en particular ha interesado hace mucho tiempo. Y entonces voy a tratar de platicar un poco algo que estamos haciendo en este sentido. Maybe I'll switch to English for the rest of the talk, so where invited speaker can also understand. So I'll start with some introduction, motivation, and first I'll talk about Bayesian networks, a brief review, because the model I'm going to describe, what are called causal Bayesian networks, are based on Bayesian networks. Then I'll talk a bit about how do we do causal inference when we have these causal networks, and then the main focus of our work that is trying to learn these causal networks from data, and an algorithm we have developed for this, and we are trying to apply this to try to decode the brain-effective connectivity. So what's causality? And I like this definition of Patrick Suppes that basically says that one event is a cause of another if the appearance of the first event is followed with high probability by the appearance of the second, and there is no third event that we use to factor out this probability relation. So an event causes another if the second event appears after the first one with a high probability, and there is not an additional event or like a hidden cause that can explain this relation between these two events. And why study causal models? Well, there are several reasons. One that is to answer causal questions, and these are some examples given by Pearl and others. For instance, how effective is a given treatment? Can we estimate the obesity-related medical costs? Could government actions have prevented a financial crisis? So many interesting questions are really causal questions. And we would like to answer these questions. Although another is to differentiate correlation from causation. And I think this is a very high-risk situation in current data mining, for example, that we discover things from the data and people assume these are causal, but this is really just a correlation. This is an example that we'll talk later, no? Is drinking wine reduces the risk of heart attacks. And also, if you represent a phenomenon using a causal model, these tend to be simpler and easier to understand than just based on correlations. So, in certain way, seems like causality helps to explain better the world and have simpler models. And then why causal Bayesian networks? Well, there have been several modeling techniques proposed for representing causal phenomena. We prefer causal Bayesian networks because this graphical representation is simple, it's easy to understand. They have been developed causal inference algorithms for this. So once we have a causal model, represented as a causal Bayesian network, we can do causal inference. And recently, there is some research on trying to learn these models from data. So before I go into these causal networks, just a brief review of Bayesian networks. So Bayesian networks are graphical representation of dependencies between a set of random variables. It's basically a directed acyclic graph that represents the dependency relation between these variables. And also, and what is more important, the network implicitly represents the conditional independence relations between these variables. So for instance, if we have this Bayesian network, we can deduce from the network that fever is independent on body ache given flu. This is what is called a common cause. Or fever is independent of unhealthy food given typhoid. It's an indirect cause. So once we know that person has typhoid, doesn't matter how it acquired it. And the case that is different is that flu and fever are independent if fever is not known. Or in other words, if we know fever, these two become dependent because it's like a common cause, and if we know one is true, then the other one becomes less probable. This is very important because in these directed models, the independence relations depend, how to estimate these independence relations depends on the direction of the arcs, a difference with the undirected models.
Estás golpeando el micrófono con la pluma, está generando.
Puedo quitar la pluma. Okay. So the formal criteria to determine independence relations in a Bayesian network is called D-separation. And well, here is a formal definition, but instead I think I'll go into these three basic cases. So if we have sequential arcs, then X and Z are independent given Y. If we have divergent, also in this case, they are independent. But when they are convergent, like in this case, like when we have this common cause, then they are not independent. And this will become important later when we see how we learn Bayesian networks and then causal networks. Another important aspect is in Bayesian networks is that we can have different structures that encode the same conditional independence relations. So in these three cases, X and Z are independent given Y. But if we think in terms of causality, these are very different, no? Because here you're saying that Y causes X and Z, and here that X causes Y and Y causes Z. So the independence relations are not the same as causality. Now, how do we learn Bayesian networks? Well, basically, to learn a Bayesian network, there are two aspects. First, to learn the structure, what are the dependency relations between the variables. And given this structure, it's relatively easy to learn the parameters, basically conditional probability of each variable given its parents in the graph. And once you have this is all you need for instance, for estimating the joint probability, given the independence relations in a Bayesian network, you just need the conditional probability of each variable given its parents. And this is one of the reasons of using these models, because they are much more compact and efficient than having to specify the joint probability of all the variables. And how do can we learn these models from data? Well, the structure of the models, there are two types of methods. One is based on independent tests. So we initially assume all variables are related to all the variables. Basically have a complete graph. And then we do independence tests between the variables and start removing some of the edges. Or the other types of, these are like more local methods, or the other types of methods are global methods in which we start from a simple network and start adding or inverting arcs and using a global measure of how good is this model with respect to the data. We find basically it's like a local minimum because the number of possible structures is very large. So you have to do a kind of heuristic search and try to find a good model for the data. I'll go into more detail of one of the methods based on the first approach of independent tests, because this has been used as a basic method for learning causal Bayesian networks. And this is called the PC algorithm, which has basically two phases. Initially, it determines what's called the skeleton, that is an undirected graph, which represents the correlations between the variables. So basically, it starts from a fully connected graph and determines conditional independence between each pair of variables given some subset of the other variables. And you do many tests until you cannot eliminate more edges and you obtain the skeleton of the network. So you have the arcs, but you don't have the directions. Then to get the directions, basically we use these tests between variable triplets. And as I said before, we have three cases. The first two we cannot distinguish because in both cases, X and Z are independent given Y. But if we find this case, then we can know the direction of the arcs. Because if X and Z are not independent given Y, then we know the arcs have to be convergent. So we look for this kind of structures in the network, and in this way, we can determine the direction of the arcs. However, usually you cannot determine all the directions because you not always find these structures in all the network. For example, if we apply the first step, we'll get the skeleton of the network that has all the edges but not the directions. And then, for instance, if we find that A and V are not independent given T, then we can set these directions. But let's say we make another test and find that T and J are independent given V, T and J are independent given A, H and A are independent given J. And given these tests, we cannot find the direction of these other arcs. So we have like a partial directed graph. We have some directions, but we don't have all of them. When you learn Bayesian networks, the directions are not so critical, so basically you can set this direction arbitrarily. But if you want to learn a causal network, then that's not true. You need to find some way to determine these directions. So I'll now go into the causal Bayesian networks. So the idea is also, these are also DAGs, but these represent causal relations, and this can be interpreted in terms of interventions. So if we set up some variable by an external agent, then you expect to get the results according to what will be a causal model. So this has stronger assumptions than Bayesian networks because we assume that all the relations implied by the network should correspond to causal relations, not just dependencies. This is a simple example of a causal network. So we say having the sprinkler or rain will cause the floor to get wet, and if the floor is wet, this will become slippery. So how do we do interventions? And this is what's by Pearl is called this do operation. So in Bayesian networks, you usually have like you observe the value of some variable, but an observation is different to an intervention. So here you set the value of some variables, you do this do operation, and then once you do the do operation, you can estimate the resulting distribution on the other variables. So this is what's called the causal inference. So there are different types of causal reasoning we can do with these models. And I'll talk briefly about two. One is causal predictions or counterfactuals. So basically, a causal prediction will be, I want to know the effect on certain variable of intervening some other variable. And the procedure is the following. We eliminate all incoming arrows to the nodes we are going to intervene. Because as we are setting these nodes, then the other variables don't have any effect on them. So we eliminate these arcs. Then we fix the value of these variables to the ones we want to intervene. And then we just do the calculation of the resulting distribution as in Bayesian networks. So this will be an example. This is another example of a causal network. So we say that health consciousness has to do with lack of exercise and unhealthy diet. And these two can produce overweight, and overweight can produce a stroke. And we'll like to measure the effect of unhealthy diet in stroke. So we do an intervention on a healthy diet. That is, we take out the incoming arc. Then we set unhealthy diet to true, and then we do the calculation to get what will be the probability of having a stroke. And this is just an example that an observation is different from intervention. So if we condition, for instance, in this case, x2, then x1 and x3 are not independent because we have these convergent arcs. So in this network, even if we set x2 to certain value, we observe x2, x1 and x3 are not independent. But if we intervene x2, then this arc disappears, and then x1 and x3 are independent. So the dependency relations in the network change if we do an observation versus an intervention. The other type of reasoning is counterfactuals. That's actually we do all the time as humans. For instance, so this is what will happen if things have been different. For instance, if someone suffered a stroke, would he still have suffered the stroke if he had exercised more? So basically, this is the procedure. So first, we modify the model in terms of the new evidence. So we say, well, although he had a stroke, I'll assume that we don't know if he had a stroke. Then we do an intervention on the variable, in this case, lack of exercise, and then we do the prediction. Okay, so this is our original network. We set stroke to unknown. We intervene lack of exercise, so we take out this arc, we set this to false, and then we estimate the probability of stroke. Okay, so now that you have a certain idea of what are these causal models, we'll go into our main interest, that is learning these models from data, but without direct interventions. So the standard way, for instance, in medicine that we learn about causality, is we do interventions. We have a control group, an intervention group, and we try to isolate all the other factors and just change one factor and see the effect. But in many cases, it's difficult to do interventions, it's costly, or even unethical to do interventions. So it's an interesting problem to see if we can learn these causal models just from observational data. And the first problem is, as I mentioned before, if you find certain dependency between two variables, usually we cannot determine without additional information if F is cause of Y or vice versa. Or there could be another factor that produces the dependency between these two variables. So returning to this example, if we find that people that drink wine tend to have lesser heart attacks, we can think of this model, but maybe the true model is this one. No? So people with high incomes tend to drink more wine and have a better medical attention and tend to have less heart attacks. So if you look only at the data of these two variables, you can get a wrong idea. No? So most of the works that have been done regarding learning these causal models make these three assumptions. No? One is causal Markov condition, so a variable is independent of its non-descendants given its direct causes, and this is what usually represents a Bayesian network. The other is faithfulness. There are no additional independencies between the variables in the model. And the main assumption, and the more difficult one, I think, is causal sufficiency. You assume there are no common confounders of the some variables. That in certain way, you are taking into account all the relevant variables in the model. And this is sometimes very difficult to satisfy. But, well, it's also more difficult to try to learn these models if you don't have this assumption. So basically, what we want to do is have some observational data, use these assumptions, and try to learn the structure, the causal structure of a model. However, what we usually get, as in the PC algorithm, is what's called an equivalence class. So we get a partially directed model in which some arcs are directed, but some arcs, we don't know the direction. So this model actually represents 4 models. That's what is called an equivalence class. So these models could be equivalent in terms of some statistical tests, although causally they are different. So basically, the challenge is how to get the directions of these links that we don't know, that are left undefined. So in general, for instance, if we use a PC algorithm, we obtain this equivalence class. And how can we determine the arcs? Well, there are different ideas, possibilities. One is to try to incorporate some background knowledge, if you have, of the phenomena. Try to do some additional tests that help you determine these directions. Or actually do interventions. So maybe you can do some interventions, get some more data, and then that will help you determine the undefined links. So we have a preliminary method we have proposed that combines two of these ideas. First, we incorporate prior knowledge, and basically we assume that we have some knowledge of the possible ways that these variables can interact. So in this example, we say these blue arcs are possible and the black ones are not possible. So we can eliminate them a priori. And in some domains, as we will see in our application, this makes sense. And the other is trying to do kind of a simulated intervention and measure this, what we call the average causal effect. So if we have a non-directed link between variables x and y, then it could be that x is a cause of y or y is a cause of x. So what we do is we set one of the variables and obtain what is called this average causal effect. So which variable has more effect on the other? So if x have more effect on y, then we assume the link goes from x to y, and if y has more effect on x, then we assume the opposite. And with this, we calculate for all the members of the equivalence class and obtain the maximum of the minimums from these tests. So with this is the algorithm. I don't expect you to go into detail, but this is basically an extension of the PC algorithm, which the blue parts are the new ones. So first we incorporate some prior knowledge, then obtain the skeleton, orient the edges that we can with these variable triplets, and the edges that are left without orientation, we apply these ACE tests and orient the rest of the edges. We start testing this on some synthetic Bayesian networks. So basically, this is how you usually test these algorithms. You have a network you know. You generate data from that network, and then try to learn the causal structure and see if what you learn is equal to the one that generated the data. And also we consider different percentage of prior knowledge. And this is a summary of the results. So we see that the discovery rate of the true direction of the links increases as we have background information and the tests. There's also some increase if we only do the tests. And this is the baseline with the PC algorithm. And this is one of the examples in which, in this case, we can recover exactly the structure. And in case of the PC algorithms, two of the links are left undefined. Well, I'll now go into the last part to just comment a bit of application of this to trying to elucidate the effective connectivity. So I'm not an expert in this aspect, so but I have my collaborator, he is. So, but basically you can take about 3 types of connectivity in the brain: structural connectivity, functional connectivity, and effective connectivity. And this has to do with causality, is when the firing of some neurons or regions of the brain causes the firing of another regions in the brain. So it's not just a correlation, but this is an effective connectivity or a causal relation. So the idea is we are using these FNIRS, near-infrared spectroscopy, to get information from different regions in the brain, and from this data, trying to obtain this causal network that represent the effective connectivity between different areas in the brain. Basically, so we are using this functional near-infrared spectroscopy that permits an indirect observation of the brain activity based on the absorption and scattering of light. And this another way to measure the activity in the brain. The advantage of this compared to an MRI is that you can use this while the people are doing some activities. They don't have to go into this machine. It's just similar to the EEG. And then people can be doing different activities, and you can measure the activity in the brain. So our initial experiment is from a data actually not collected from us, collected from a study at Imperial College London, that they do some experiment with the different surgeons while they are trying to repeat a non-time task. These were divided in 3 groups: consultant, trainees, and medical students. So from more experts to less experts. In that case, the interest of the study was seeing the differences between brain activity in these different types of neurosurgeons. But in our case, we were just trying to learn the causal structure for each group and then for all combined. And we did use this learning algorithm, the FCI, and then incorporate background knowledge and compare what is the results using just the basic structural learning algorithm and incorporate the background knowledge. So what's the background knowledge? Well, this is based on the structural information we have about brain connectivity, what is called the connectome. So these are the known paths that are between the different regions in the brain. So that's what I was saying before as our background knowledge. If there is no path, then there cannot be a direct causal relation between those regions. So we use this to eliminate some possible arcs in the network. And then we compare the networks that were learned with the basic algorithm with the one incorporate the background knowledge, and we see that more arcs were determined with more relations than without incorporating this background knowledge. This is measured here. So we have the number of undefined links between the original algorithm and incorporated background knowledge. We see in all cases that this is reduced, although we still have a lot of undefined edges. And these are just some network parameters: characteristic path length, global efficiency, network diameter. Not much can be said from this, except that, for instance, we have a higher efficiency in the experts that suggests that the incorporation of expected abstract information can reveal a more realistic information. No, it's expected that the experts will have a higher efficiency. So that's where we are until now. We are working on comparing our structural learning algorithm with other recent approaches. We want to obtain additional FNSR data under different conditions in which we can also have interventions. So we can combine observational and interventional data, and then going into a dynamic model. Now, these are static models, but having temporal information is basically very useful also to determine causality. This is joint work with our PhD students Samuel Montero, Felipe Orihuela, and collaborators at Imperial College. And if you want to know more, these are two books on causality, one Pearl. And in general, if you want to learn more of probabilistic graphical models, there's also my book. Okay, thank you.
¿Hay esperanza en aplicaciones de data mining? sea, ¿hay alguna esperanza de tener, de establecer relaciones causales en aplicaciones en data mining?
Yo creo que sí, aunque algo como lo que mostraba aquí, ¿no? Que no encuentres todas las relaciones, pero puedes encontrar algunas, y eso ya es, creo que, bastante útil, ¿no? Causales. Hay trabajos preliminares. Recuerdo un estudio relacionado a cuestión de problemas, sin acordarme, de déficit de atención y esto en niños. Yo recuerdo un trabajo de eso que trataban de ver ahí aspectos causales, ¿no? Creo que hay aspectos como el sexo o otras medidas psicológicas, y ahí se encontraron aparentemente ciertas relaciones en que sí parecen una relación causal y otras que no está claro. Pero es un área joven realmente, pero yo creo que sí hay esperanzas de que se puedan aprender ciertas cosas, claro, bajo ciertas suposiciones, y eso es también lo que se está trabajando, ¿no? Hacer métodos que puedan relajar algunas de estas suposiciones, sobre todo la última de causal sufficiency, o sea, de que pueda haber otras variables ocultas. Entonces hay algunos métodos que están empezando a usar esto, y entonces dicen, bueno, aquí no puedo saber realmente si hay una variable oculta, pero te dicen, al menos hay una posible variable oculta entre estas dos variables. Eso también se empieza a trabajar.
Cuando iniciaste tu plática, me acordé. Gracias. Plática para empezar. Yo no sé mucho de esto, pero se me hizo muy interesante y me acordé de la diferencia que mencionaste al principio de correlación y causa. O sea, muchas veces dos variables, como tú lo mencionaste muy, muy claramente, pues pueden aparecer los datos correlacionados, pero no ser una causa uno del otro, pues. Y eso, pues tú lo pusiste ahí, en medicina sucede mucho. Y me acuerdo, bueno, aunque en los 80s, noventas más bien, cuando salió lo del SIDA, que había un grupo de investigadores, me acuerdo de un tal Duisberg, que precisamente fue la primera vez que oí eso, que no todas las relaciones de estadísticas pues eran una causa de la otra. Este tipo de cosas, yo creo que la aplicación más inmediata, se me imagina, pues, es en medicina. ¿En qué otra área? De hecho, tú también lo estás aplicando un poco a cuestiones biológicas, pero ¿en qué otra cosa puede aplicarse?
Bueno, creo que un poco los ejemplos que ponía al principio daban otras, por ejemplo, también en cuestiones económicas o financieras, ¿no?
Ah, ya.
O sea, si vas a hacer cierta acción, intervención en la economía, eso va a causar algo, ¿qué efectos va a tener? Eso creo que es como muy importante, ¿no? Para la toma de decisiones a nivel económico, financiero.
Sí, ya me acordé, tú lo pusiste ahí, si la intervención del gobierno hubiera evitado la crisis del 2008, sí es cierto.
Y yo creo que también en general en cosas de ciencia, ¿no? Muchas de la trabajo en ciencia pues es encontrar estas relaciones causales, ¿no?
Claro. Ok, gracias.
Sí.
Si yo tengo un problema que es, por ejemplo, cuando tengo dos neuronas que me aparecen como si estuvieran conectadas, dos neuronas corticales, pero realmente una posibilidad es que pudieran estar pareciendo conectadas porque están comandadas o porque les manda información una subcortical. Sí. Pero ¿qué tal si yo no puedo encontrar la actividad de la subcortical? ¿Puedo resolver ese problema?
Hay trabajo en ese sentido, y eso es como que se llaman aquí como variables ocultas. O sea, que tú dices, bueno, yo puedo poner una variable en el modelo, aunque no sé si, no la puedo medir, por ejemplo, pero sí lo puedo modelar. O también estos trabajos que mencionaba que de acuerdo a los datos pueden decir, bueno, estas dos variables sí hay una cierta correlación, pero la hipótesis es que realmente hay una variable oculta que las está afectando, y sí hay trabajos en ese camino, pues.
Gracias.